She satisfies empire worth billions. She had conquered satisfies markets nobody thought a woman could touch. But standing on that stage, under 1,000 crystal lights, it wasn't an investor or a rival who finally broke her. It was her own daughter. One question, one microphone. One 10-year-old girl tired of watching her mother pretend she didn't need anyone. Mom, when am I finally getting a dad I can actually love? And just like that, Vanessa Whitmore's perfectly constructed world cracked wide open, in front of every person she'd ever tried to impress. If you want to find out what happens when a billionaire stops running from her own heart, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. And let's begin. The chandeliers inside the Grand Meridian Hotel had been imported from Vienna 60 years ago, back when Manhattan's elite still cared about that kind of thing. Tonight, 1,200 of them hung above 500 guests, throwing fractured light across champagne flutes, silk gowns, and the kind of smiles that cost more than most people's houses. Vanessa Whitmore stood backstage, pressing her thumb against the inside of her wrist, where her pulse hammered faster than she wanted to admit. She was wearing a midnight blue dress that her stylist had selected 3 weeks ago. Her hair was pulled back tight enough to give her a headache she'd been ignoring since 4 o'clock. Her shoes pinched at the left heel, a half size too small because the right size hadn't arrived in time, and she refused to change the design. She looked perfect. She felt like she was about to throw up. 2 minutes, Ms. Whitmore, said Gerald, her communications director, appearing at her elbow with his tablet and his permanent expression of controlled anxiety. The governor just finished. Crowd's warm, energy's good. You'll walk out from stage left, pause at the mark, then... I know the mark, Gerald. Right, of course. He scrolled through something on his screen. One thing. Emma's seated at table 4 with Margaret. She was asking for you about 20 minutes ago. Vanessa's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Asking what? Just asking where you were. Margaret handled it. Fine. Gerald hesitated. She could feel him wanting to say something else, but then he just nodded and backed away. Smart man. Vanessa closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Not to pray, not to meditate, just to remind herself who she was supposed to be when she stepped out there. Vanessa Whitmore, founder and CEO of Whitmore Development Group. Forbes cover, twice. Net worth somewhere north of $4 billion depending on the quarter. The youngest woman to ever take a commercial real estate firm from a startup to a publicly traded company. The woman who rebuilt half of Midtown's waterfront when every bank in the city said it couldn't be done. The woman who had buried her husband 6 years ago and hadn't stopped moving since. She opened her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and walked out. The applause hit her like warm water. 500 people rising to their feet, clapping not because they loved her, but because they respected what she represented. Money that moved, power that delivered, a name that meant something on a contract. She reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and smiled the way she'd been smiling at events like this for years. Wide enough to seem genuine, controlled enough to reveal nothing. Thank you, she said. Thank you all for being here tonight. The Whitmore Foundation's Family Housing Initiative isn't just a tax write-off, though I know some of you are already calculating that in your heads. Laughter. Polite, well-timed, lubricated by 3 rounds of open bar. This initiative exists because I believe every child deserves a home that doesn't come with conditions, a home where the lights stay on, where the walls don't leak, where a kid can do homework at a kitchen table instead of on the floor of a shelter. She paused, letting the silence do the work. She'd rehearsed this speech 4 times. She knew exactly where the emotional beats were supposed to land. My late husband, David, and I talked about this work years before we ever had the resources to fund it. He used to say that buildings are just bones. People are what make them breathe. Another pause. She let David's name hang in the air just long enough to feel heavy without becoming uncomfortable. Tonight, I'm proud to announce that Whitmore Development will be committing $240 million over the next 5 years to... The sound of a chair scraping against the ballroom floor cut through her sentence. Vanessa's eyes flicked toward table 4. Emma was standing up. Margaret, Vanessa's longtime assistant, and the closest thing Emma had to a full-time caretaker, was reaching for the girl's arm, whispering something urgent. But Emma pulled away with the kind of deliberate 10-year-old determination that couldn't be stopped by whispers. She was wearing the pale yellow dress they'd picked out together last weekend. Her dark hair was braided the way she liked. 2 braids, not one, because one braid made her look too fancy. She was small for her age, and her face still carried the kind of baby softness that made strangers underestimate her constantly. But her eyes, David's eyes, brown with flecks of gold, were locked on her mother with something Vanessa hadn't seen there before. Resolution. Emma walked toward the stage. The crowd noticed. Of course they noticed. 500 people in a room, and every single one of them tracked the small girl in yellow as she walked between the tables with her chin up and her hands balled at her sides. Gerald appeared at the edge of the stage, his face a portrait of professional horror. He was making a cut gesture with his hand, trying to signal someone, the event coordinator, security, anyone, to intercept. But nobody moved. Because here's the thing about a child walking through a room full of powerful adults. Nobody wants to be the one who grabs her. Emma reached the edge of the stage. There were 3 steps up. She climbed them carefully, her dress shoes clicking on the polished wood. Vanessa watched her daughter approach with a smile frozen on her face. She was already calculating how to make this look spontaneous, how to fold Emma into the speech, how to turn this into a charming mother-daughter moment the press would eat up. "Sweetheart," Vanessa said, leaning toward the microphone but keeping her voice soft, "did you want to come say hi to everyone?" Emma didn't answer. She walked straight to the podium, stood on her toes, and pulled the microphone down to her level with both hands. The sound system squealed for half a second. Someone in the back winced. "Mom," Emma said. Her voice was clear, too clear. The kind of clarity that only comes from a child who has rehearsed something in her head 100 times and is finally saying it out loud. "When am I finally getting a dad I can actually love?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Vanessa had ever heard. It wasn't the polite silence of an audience waiting for a punchline. It wasn't the respectful silence of a memorial or a tribute. It was the raw, breathless silence of 500 people who had just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Vanessa's smile didn't drop. It stayed exactly where it was, pinned to her face like a mask nailed to a wall. But behind it, something inside her chest was collapsing so fast she could feel her breath turning shallow. "Emma, you said we'd talk about it." Emma's voice was smaller now, but the microphone caught every syllable. "You said after my birthday. Then you said after the summer. Then you said after the new building. You always say after something." Vanessa reached for her daughter, but Emma stepped back, Kupas. Just one step, but it was enough to make the gesture look like a rejection on camera, and Vanessa knew that every phone in the room was recording. "I don't need more buildings, Mom," Emma said. "I need a family." Vanessa felt the heat crawling up her neck. She could see Gerald at the side of the stage, white-knuckled, clutching his tablet like a life preserver. She could see the governor's wife covering her mouth. She could see Marcus Webb, her biggest investor, leaning forward in his chair with an expression that was either fascination or alarm. She had 2 choices. She could laugh it off, scoop Emma into a hug, make a joke about kids saying the darndest things, redirect to the speech, and let Gerald's PR team manage the fallout by morning. It would work. People would forget. The story would trend for a day, maybe 2, then disappear under the next news cycle. That was the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice every advisor she'd ever hired would tell her to make. Vanessa looked down at her daughter. Emma's eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was holding it together with the kind of discipline that no 10-year-old should have to know. And in that moment, Vanessa didn't see a child who was misbehaving. She saw a girl who had been waiting, patiently, quietly, for years, while her mother built an empire and pretended that was enough. Vanessa reached out again, slowly this time, and took Emma's hand. The girl didn't pull away. She squeezed back so hard that Vanessa could feel the small bones pressing against her palm. Vanessa lifted the microphone. "My daughter," she said, and her voice cracked on the second word in a way she couldn't hide. "Just asked me a question that I've been avoiding for 6 years." The room didn't breathe. "I have spent every day since my husband died building companies, building projects, building walls. Because I thought that if I stopped moving, I would have to feel what I was actually running from." She paused. Not for dramatic effect, because she genuinely didn't know what she was going to say next. This wasn't the speech. This wasn't rehearsed. This was happening. Emma is right, Vanessa said. I keep saying after this deal, after this quarter, after this project. But she's growing up in between all those afters, and I'm not paying attention. She looked down at Emma, then back at the crowd. So here's what I'm going to do, and I'm saying it here because if I don't say it in front of 500 witnesses, I'll find a way to talk myself out of it by tomorrow morning. A few nervous laughs, but mostly silence. Emma and I are going to spend the next month meeting people, real people, not arranged by PR firms, not vetted by background check companies, not curated by whatever algorithm decides who's appropriate for a woman in my position. We're going to go to parks, grocery stores, PTA meetings, wherever normal people go to find connection. She took a breath. No cameras, no television deal, no reality show circus, just a mother and her daughter looking for what we've been missing. The applause that followed was strange, hesitant at first, then building, then overwhelming. But Vanessa barely heard it. She was crouching down, pulling Emma close, pressing her face against her daughter's hair. I'm sorry, she whispered into Emma's braids. Emma wrapped her arms around her mother's neck. I didn't mean to do it in front of everyone. Yes, you did. A tiny pause. Yeah, I did. Vanessa almost laughed. Almost. By midnight, 3 different news networks had run the clip. By morning, it had 12 million views across platforms. By noon the next day, every talk show host in the country was requesting an interview. Gerald called Vanessa at 7:15 a.m. She was sitting in her kitchen in her pajamas, eating cereal with Emma, and she let it ring twice before answering. The board is requesting an emergency call, Gerald said. His voice had the careful neutrality of a man who had been awake since 4. About what? About your announcement. Marcus Webb is concerned about optics. He wants to know if this was a planned media strategy or his words, spontaneous emotional meltdown. Vanessa spooned another bite of cereal. Tell Marcus it was a strategic initiative in stakeholder family engagement. Vanessa, Gerald, I have a meeting at 9. I'll handle Marcus. Don't let the PR team release any statements yet. They've already drafted 6. Delete all of them. She hung up and looked at Emma, who was reading the back of the cereal box with exaggerated concentration. You heard all of that, Vanessa said. Yep. Are you worried? Emma shrugged. Are you going to actually do it, or is this an after thing? It stung. Not because it was mean. It wasn't. It stung because it was fair. I'm going to actually do it, Vanessa said. Emma looked up from the cereal box, studied her mother for a long moment, then nodded once, like she was approving a business proposal. Okay. The first week was a disaster, not publicly. Publicly, it was a sensation. Billionaire mom's searches for love became the kind of story that lived on every platform simultaneously. Supportive, mocking, analytical, inspirational. The internet couldn't decide what Vanessa was, brave or ridiculous, so it decided she was both. But privately, behind the closed doors of Whitmore Development's 53rd floor headquarters, the reality was uglier. Marcus Webb cornered Vanessa after the emergency board meeting on Tuesday. Marcus was 62, silver-haired, permanently tanned, and had been an early investor in Whitmore Development back when Vanessa was still operating out of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn. He had believed in her when no one else did. He never let her forget it. I need to understand what you're doing, he said, standing in her office with his hands in his pockets, the way he always stood when he wanted to seem casual while being anything but. I made an announcement. I'm following through. You made a public spectacle in front of the governor, in front of 3 network cameras, in front of people who have real money in your company. My company. Our company, Vanessa. That's how publicly traded works. She leaned back in her chair. My personal life has nothing to do with quarterly performance. Everything you do has to do with quarterly performance. You're not just a CEO, you're the brand. When you stand on a stage and announce that you're going to wander around grocery stores looking for a boyfriend, people get nervous. I didn't say boyfriend. The internet did. Vanessa pressed her fingers against her temples. She had a headache again. She always had a headache these days. Marcus, I appreciate your concern. I do. But Emma asked me a question, and I owe her an honest answer. She's 10. Give her a puppy. Don't. The word came out harder than she intended. And Marcus blinked. In 12 years of working together, Vanessa could count on one hand the number of times she'd let her tone go sharp with him. My daughter stood up in front of 500 people and told me she's lonely, Vanessa said. I'm not going to buy my way out of that. Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed. The deep performative sigh of a man who knew he wasn't going to win, but wanted credit for trying. Fine, but if this turns into a tabloid circus, the board will respond. I'm telling you that as a friend. He wasn't her friend. He was an investor who liked calling himself a friend because it made his leverage feel less transactional. But Vanessa nodded anyway. Noted. Her executive team, led by her chief operating officer, Patricia Huang, took a different approach. Patricia was 45, efficient to the point of clinical, and had never once in 7 years asked Vanessa a personal question. Now she sat across from Vanessa's desk with a leather folder and a plan. I've compiled a list, Patricia said, sliding the folder across the desk. A list. 17 candidates, all pre-screened, successful professionals, philanthropically active, media compatible. 3 are widowers, which is a strong narrative parallel. 2 have children, which addresses Emma's concern directly. 1 is a retired Olympic athlete, which polls extremely well in the 35 to 54 female demographic. Vanessa stared at the folder. You made a list of men for me to date. I made a list of strategic relationship candidates that align with your public brand and personal values. Those are the same thing, Patricia. They don't have to be. Vanessa opened the folder. Headshots, bios, net worth summaries, philanthropic affiliations, media footprints. It looked like a casting call for a television show about wealthy men who played golf and talked about their wine cellars. Jonathan Reed, Vanessa read aloud. Age 38, hedge fund manager. Divorced, no children. Interests include sailing, modern art, and, she paused, curating authentic human experiences. Patricia nodded. He's very popular on social media. Strong jawline. This says his last relationship ended because, and I'm quoting his publicist, they were on different journeys. That's standard PR language. That's language that means nothing, Patricia. But Vanessa took the folder home anyway, because she didn't know what else to do. She hadn't been on a date in 6 years. She hadn't been on a first date in 13. The last time she'd met someone new, she was 22, broke, sharing a studio apartment in Queens, and David had walked into the coffee shop where she worked because he heard they had the best empanadas in the neighborhood. They didn't. The empanadas were terrible. David came back every day for 2 weeks before Vanessa finally told him the truth. You know our empanadas are bad, right? He'd grinned. That stupid, lopsided grin that never photographed well but in person could light up an entire room. I'm not here for the empanadas. That was it. That was the whole beginning. No screening, no strategy. Just a man with bad taste in food and a good heart standing at a counter, hoping the girl behind it would notice him. Vanessa closed the folder and pressed her hands over her face. She didn't want 17 candidates. She didn't want headshots and net worth summaries. She wanted someone to walk into a coffee shop and come back tomorrow because they wanted to see her again. But she was Vanessa Whitmore now. She couldn't walk into a coffee shop without being photographed. She couldn't go to a park without security. She couldn't exist in public without every interaction being filtered through the lens of who she was and what she was worth. She'd built the walls so high that now she couldn't see over them. And Emma was growing up inside those walls, and she was tired of the view. Over the next 10 days, Vanessa met 5 of Patricia's candidates. Jonathan Reed took her to a private gallery opening where he spent 45 minutes explaining why a particular shade of blue was emotionally disruptive. Emma, who had been promised she could come to every meeting, sat in a corner eating crackers, and later told Vanessa that Jonathan talked like a commercial. The second candidate, Dr. Peter Calloway, was a pediatric surgeon who seemed genuinely kind until he spent their entire lunch describing his plans for a children's health app. which he hoped Vanessa might consider investing in. "This isn't an ask," he said 3 separate times. It was absolutely an ask. The third was a tech entrepreneur named James Overton, who brought Emma a gift, a custom-built drone that cost more than most people's cars. Emma thanked him politely, then later told Vanessa she liked the drone, but "he only talked to me when you were watching." The fourth, a retired diplomat, was pleasant and forgettable. The fifth was Charles Beaumont. Charles was different from the others, and Vanessa could tell immediately why Patricia had placed him at the top of her list. He was 50, which was older than Vanessa's preference, but he wore his age well. Distinguished, silver at the temples, the kind of face that suggested experience rather than exhaustion. He was a senior executive at Harrington Capital, one of Whitmore Development's largest institutional investors. He had 3 grown children. He was widowed himself, and unlike the others, he didn't try to impress Vanessa. He tried to understand her. "I know what it's like," Charles said over dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant in the village, "losing someone and then building a fortress so you never have to lose anyone again." Vanessa had nodded. "It works until your daughter starts asking questions you can't answer." "Children have a gift for that," Charles smiled. The kind of warm, practiced smile that made people feel seen. "My youngest Caroline once asked me at Thanksgiving dinner why I was smiling with my mouth but not my eyes, in front of my entire family. What did you do?" "I excused myself and cried in the bathroom for 10 minutes. Then I came back and had pie." Vanessa laughed. It felt good. Real, almost. Charles was attentive without being aggressive. He asked about Emma without trying to befriend her too quickly. He complimented Vanessa's work without making it sound like he was evaluating a portfolio. And at the end of dinner, he didn't try to kiss her. He simply said, "I'd like to see you again, if that's something you're open to." Vanessa said yes. But that night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling the way she did most nights, she couldn't find the feeling she was looking for. Charles was everything he was supposed to be: smart, appropriate, emotionally available, properly devastated by his own loss. He was perfect on paper. And that was exactly the problem. 2 days later, Vanessa brought Emma to the construction site on West 47th Street. The Whitmore Riverside project was supposed to be the crown jewel of the company's portfolio, a 42-story mixed-use tower combining luxury condos with the affordable family housing units that Vanessa's foundation was funding. It was the biggest thing she'd ever built. It was also behind schedule, over budget, and currently the subject of 3 pending lawsuits from neighborhood associations who didn't want affordable housing near their brownstones. Vanessa didn't usually bring Emma to construction sites, but Margaret had called in sick, Gerald was at a conference in Chicago, and the nanny Vanessa had hired last month had already quit because Emma kept correcting her vocabulary. "I don't correct her vocabulary," Emma had protested in the car. "I just told her that irregardless isn't a word. It's technically a word. It's just not a good one." That's what I said. Then she cried. Emma: "She cried a lot, Mom." So here they were, Vanessa in a hard hat and heels that were completely wrong for a construction site, Emma in her school clothes with a visitor badge clipped to her jacket, walking through the lobby of what would eventually become the most expensive building on the west side. The project manager, a weathered man named Frank DeLuca, met them at the elevator bank. "Miss Whitmore, we've got a situation on the 31st floor. The HVAC installation team found a discrepancy in the structural load calculations. I'd like you to see it yourself." "Can it wait until tomorrow?" "I have Emma with me." Frank glanced at Emma, then back at Vanessa with the expression of a man who wanted to say no but knew he couldn't. "It can wait. But the longer we wait, the more expensive it gets." Of course it did. Everything always got more expensive the longer she waited. That was the fundamental law of construction, of business, of life. "Fine, we'll go up." They stepped into the service elevator, a raw industrial box of steel and cables that smelled like concrete dust and machine oil. Emma looked around with the wide-eyed curiosity she reserved for anything that felt genuinely different from her usual world of town cars and penthouses. "This elevator is ugly," she said. "It's functional," Vanessa said. "Those aren't the same thing." The elevator lurched upward. The cables hummed. Emma counted floors out loud, a habit she'd had since she was 5, Something David used to do with her when they lived in the old apartment building on the Lower East Side before the money changed everything. 14, 15, 16. The lights went out. The elevator stopped. Not gradually, not with a gentle deceleration. It just stopped. A sudden, violent halt that threw Vanessa against the wall and sent Emma to the floor. Darkness. Complete, absolute darkness. Emma! Vanessa dropped to her knees, her hands searching blindly until they found her daughter's arm. Are you okay? Are you hurt? I'm okay. Emma's voice was small, shaking. Mom, I can't see. I know. The lights went out. It's just a power issue. We're fine. But Vanessa's own heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure Emma could hear it. She pulled out her phone. No signal, of course. They were inside a concrete shaft in the middle of an unfinished building. Hello? Vanessa shouted toward the elevator doors. We're stuck. Can anyone hear us? Nothing. Hello? Emma's breathing was getting faster. Vanessa could feel it. The rapid, shallow rhythm of a child on the edge of panic. Mom, I don't like this. I don't like this. I want to get out. We're going to get out, I promise. Someone knows we're here. What if they don't? What if nobody... Frank knows we got in the elevator. He's probably already calling someone right now. But Vanessa's own voice was thinner than she wanted it to be, and Emma was a perceptive kid. Too perceptive sometimes. She could hear the strain. Mom? Emma's hand found Vanessa's in the dark and squeezed. I'm scared. And there it was. The thing Vanessa couldn't fix with money, influence, or a phone call to the right person. Her daughter was afraid in the dark, and Vanessa was afraid too, and all the billions in the world couldn't turn the lights back on. The minutes stretched. Vanessa tried shouting again, tried banging on the doors, tried her phone. Still no signal. The elevator car felt smaller with every passing second, the walls pressing closer, the air thickening with concrete dust and the metallic smell of old cables. Emma had stopped talking. She was pressed against Vanessa's side, her face buried in her mother's jacket, breathing in short, ragged bursts. Then a voice came through the door. Hey, anyone in there? It was calm, not the frantic urgency of a rescue team or the official authority of building management, just calm, like someone checking if a room was occupied. Yes, Vanessa shouted. We're stuck. 2 of us. My daughter is 10. She's scared. Okay. My name's Ryan. I work in the building. I'm going to get you out, but it might take a few minutes. The power tripped on the whole east side of the grid. I need to reset the backup manually. How long? Maybe 15 minutes. The junction box is 2 floors down, and it's a manual reset. I've done it before. My daughter. She's hyperventilating. A pause. Then, what's her name? Emma. Emma? The voice shifted. Not louder, but warmer, directed specifically at the girl. Hey, Emma, my name's Ryan. Can you hear me? Emma lifted her face from Vanessa's jacket. Yeah. Good. Listen, I'm going to be right here. I'm not going anywhere until you're out of there. But while I go flip the switch to get the power back, I want you to try something for me. Can you do that? I don't know. That's honest. I appreciate that. Here's what I want you to try. Put your hand flat on the floor. Can you feel the metal? Emma reached down. Yeah, it's cold. Good. Now press hard. Feel how solid it is? That floor has held thousands of people. It's not going anywhere. Neither are you. But it's dark. I know, dark is scary. But here's a secret about the dark. It's the exact same room you were standing in when the lights were on. Nothing changed, nothing moved, the room didn't get smaller. Your brain just thinks it did. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, that's kind of a dumb secret. Vanessa heard something she wasn't expecting through the door. A laugh. A real one. Surprised. Genuine. Yeah, you're right. It is kind of dumb, but is it working? Emma's breathing had slowed. Not completely. She was still scared, but the edge of panic had receded. A little, Emma admitted. Good enough. I'm going to go flip the switch now. Count to 500. When you get there, the lights should be back. If they're not, count again. I'll be back before you hit 1,000. What if I lose count? Start over. The counting's the point, not the number. And then he was gone. Footsteps fading down the corridor, moving fast but not running. The sound of someone who knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he needed to do. Emma started counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Vanessa sat in the dark with her daughter's hand in hers and listened to the counting and waited and tried very hard not to think about the fact that a maintenance worker she'd never met had just calmed her child more effectively in 60 seconds than she had in 5 minutes. 212, 213. The lights came on at 431. The elevator lurched once, then resumed its upward climb. Emma blinked against the sudden brightness, looked at Vanessa, and said with perfect deadpan seriousness, "I wasn't even close to 1,000. The doors opened on the 31st floor. Frank was standing there with 2 members of the building crew, looking stricken. "Ms. Whitmore, I am so sorry. The East Grid has been unreliable for weeks. We've been pushing for a full replacement, but the contractor—" "Where's Ryan?" Vanessa asked. Frank blinked. "Who?" "Ryan. The man who talked us through the door. The one who reset the power." Frank looked at the 2 crew members. They shrugged. "I'm not sure which—" "Find him." Oops. They found him in his basement 40 minutes later. He was crouched next to an electrical junction box with a flashlight between his teeth and both hands inside a tangle of wiring that looked, to Vanessa's untrained eye, like something that should have been replaced 10 years ago. He was wearing gray work coveralls with the building's maintenance company logo on the back. His hands were dirty, his hair was dark, slightly too long, pushed back from his forehead in a way that suggested he'd cut it himself and didn't care how it looked. He was maybe 30, maybe 32, average height, average build, the kind of face you wouldn't notice twice at a coffee shop. He heard them approach and looked up, took the flashlight out of his mouth. "You got out okay?" he said, looking at Emma. "Yeah," Emma said. "I only counted to 431. "That's pretty solid. My son usually gives up at 200. "You have a son?" "Noah. He's 8. He hates counting, too." Emma smiled. It was small, almost reluctant, but it was there. Vanessa extended her hand. "I'm Vanessa Whitmore." He wiped his palm on his coveralls before shaking hers. His grip was firm, but not performative. No squeeze, no power play, no lingering. "Ryan Carter. You work here?" "Building maintenance. I float between a few of the development sites in the area." "You knew exactly how to reset the power grid." Ryan shrugged. "I've worked in buildings like this for a while. You get to know the systems." There was something in the way he said it, casual, almost dismissive, that made Vanessa's instincts prick up. People who got to know the systems of a 42-story construction project didn't usually work in maintenance. They worked in engineering. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did, for how you talked to Emma." She was scared. Talking helps. "It does. But the way you talked to her, that wasn't just talking. You knew what you were doing." Ryan looked at her for a moment. His expression wasn't guarded exactly. It was more like a door that was closed but not locked. "I've got a kid," he said. "You learn." And then he went back to the junction box, and that was it. Vanessa stood there for a moment longer than was professionally appropriate, watching a maintenance worker in dirty coveralls do something careful and precise with electrical wiring, and she felt something she couldn't quite name. Not attraction. Not yet. Something quieter. Something like the first moment of stillness after a long, loud, exhausting day, when you finally stop moving and realize the silence doesn't feel empty. It feels like relief. Emma tugged her sleeve. "Mom, can we go? I'm hungry." "Yeah." Vanessa turned away. "Let's go." But in the car, 15 minutes later, Emma said something that Vanessa would think about for the next 3 days. "He didn't ask who you were." Vanessa looked at her daughter. "What?" "Ryan. He didn't ask who you were. Everyone always asks who you are. He just helped." Vanessa didn't have a response for that, so she just drove, and the city blurred past, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a door she'd kept locked for a very long time creaked open. Just a crack. just enough to let in the smallest sliver of light. She didn't push it wider. She didn't slam it shut either. She just let it be. 3 days passed before Vanessa found an excuse to go back to the construction site. She told herself it was about the HVAC discrepancy Frank had mentioned. She told herself the structural load calculations needed her personal attention. She told Gerald she wanted to walk the 31st floor again to see the progress on the east wing framing. All of these things were true, technically, in the way that half-truths are always technically true. Accurate enough to survive scrutiny, hollow enough to fool no one who was paying attention. Gerald was paying attention. "You want to visit the site again," he said, standing in her office doorway with his tablet and his eyebrows slightly raised. "You visited that site twice in 3 months. Now, twice in 1 week. The project is behind schedule. The project has been behind schedule since February. You didn't care about it then. I care about it now." Gerald studied her for a moment. The particular study of a man who had worked for Vanessa long enough to recognize when she was lying, but smart enough not to say so directly. "Should I arrange a car?" "I'll drive myself." Both eyebrows went up this time. Vanessa Whitmore did not drive herself to construction sites. Vanessa Whitmore was driven to construction sites by a man named Eduardo in a black SUV with tinted windows, and a partition she never closed because she didn't care if Eduardo heard her phone calls. "I'll drive myself," she repeated in the tone that ended conversations. Gerald nodded and disappeared. Vanessa sat in her office for another 10 minutes, staring at a financial report she wasn't reading, and tried to understand what she was doing. She was a woman who planned everything. She planned her meals 3 days in advance. She planned her outfits a week ahead. She planned board meetings 6 months out with agendas that ran to 30 pages. She did not do things without knowing why she was doing them. But she couldn't name this. It wasn't about Ryan. That's what she kept telling herself. It was about the project, about the electrical grid that had failed and nearly trapped her daughter, about accountability and safety standards and the kind of operational diligence that separated her company from every second-rate developer in the city. It wasn't about the way his voice had sounded through the elevator door, steady, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world for a scared little girl in the dark. It wasn't about that. She grabbed her keys and left. The site was louder than she remembered. Concrete saws screaming on the upper floors, steel beams swinging from cranes, men in hard hats shouting over the noise in a mixture of English and Spanish that had its own rough music. Vanessa signed in at the security trailer, took a hard hat from the rack, and walked through the ground floor lobby where the marble tiles were still stacked in crates against the far wall. She found Frank first. He walked her through the HVAC issue, a genuine problem involving load-bearing calculations that didn't match the original engineering specs. The numbers were off by margins that looked small on paper, but could mean catastrophic failure in a finished building. "How did this happen?" Vanessa asked, staring at the blueprint spread across a folding table in the site office. Frank rubbed the back of his neck. "The original engineering firm signed off on everything. But when we started the installation, the actual loads didn't match the projections. Either they miscalculated or they used outdated seismic data. Either way, if we install the HVAC system as designed, we're putting too much weight on the east cantilever." "How much weight?" "Enough to matter." "Frank, 14% above the margin of safety." Vanessa felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the physical manifestation of a problem that was going to cost millions in months and possibly her reputation. 14% wasn't a small error. 14% was the kind of thing that made buildings crack. "Get me the original engineering reports, all of them. I want third-party verification by end of week." "That's going to cost—" "I know what it's going to cost." She left the site office and walked through the building's ground floor, not heading anywhere specific, just moving the way she always moved when she was trying to think. Forward, fast, as if the answer was somewhere ahead of her, and she just needed to catch up to it. She found Ryan on the 4th floor. He was kneeling beside an exposed section of ductwork, one hand inside the shaft, the other holding a flashlight. There was a smear of something dark across his forearm, and his coveralls had a fresh tear near the left knee. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and for a moment his expression was blank. Not unfriendly, just the face of a man who didn't expect anyone important to be walking through an unfinished floor at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday. Then recognition landed. "Ms. Whitmore." "Vanessa." He looked at her for a beat longer than was comfortable. Vanessa, then. I wanted to thank you again for the elevator. You already thanked me. I know. But Emma hasn't stopped talking about you, and I realized I didn't even ask if you were okay. Resetting that junction box, that's not exactly a small job. Ryan pulled his hand out of the ductwork and wiped it on his coveralls. It's part of the job. It's not, actually. That junction box is the electrical contractor's responsibility. You're building maintenance. Something shifted in his face. A flicker of surprise, quickly smoothed. You looked into that? I look into everything. He stood up, brushed off his knees, and regarded her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't suspicious exactly, more like the cautious assessment of someone who had learned the hard way that powerful people asking questions usually wanted something. The electrical contractor was gone for the day, he said. Your daughter was stuck in the dark. I knew how to fix it, so I fixed it. Most maintenance workers wouldn't know how to manually reset an industrial junction box on a 42-story building. Ryan said nothing. I did some checking, Vanessa continued. Ryan Carter, civil engineering degree from Columbia, graduated top of your class. Worked for Mercer and Holt for 5 years. You were on the design team for 3 major commercial projects in the city, including the Harborview Tower on the East River. His jaw tightened. It was the first crack in his composure she'd seen. A small one, but unmistakable. That was a long time ago. 4 years isn't that long. It is when everything between then and now happened. Vanessa waited. She was good at waiting. In boardrooms, silence was her best weapon. Most people couldn't stand it and would fill it with whatever truth they were trying to hide. But Ryan didn't fill the silence. He just stood there, holding his flashlight, looking at her with those steady brown eyes that gave away nothing and everything at once. You don't have to tell me, she said, but I'm curious why a man with your credentials is doing maintenance work. Ryan looked at the ductwork, at the unfinished walls around them, at the raw concrete floor where someday rich people would walk on polished marble and never think about the men who built the bones underneath it. Mercer and Holt was cutting corners, he said finally, on the Harborview project, using substandard rebar in the foundation, falsifying inspection reports. The kind of stuff that doesn't show up until 10 years later when a building starts cracking and nobody can figure out why. And you reported it. I reported it to my supervisor first. He told me to keep my mouth shut. I reported it to the partners. They offered me money to keep my mouth shut. I reported it to the city. And that's when they stopped offering money and started making phone calls. What kind of phone calls? The kind that make sure nobody in the industry will hire you. The kind that turn a 30-year career plan into a maintenance job in a studio apartment in Queens. His voice was flat. Not bitter. He'd moved past bitter into something harder and quieter. The resignation of a man who had done the right thing and paid for it and had made peace with the cost. Or at least made peace with pretending he was at peace with the cost. Did anything happen? Vanessa asked. To Mercer and Holt? The city opened an investigation. It's still open. 4 years later, it's still open. Meanwhile, the partners are still building, still billing, still showing up at charity galas in $5,000 suits. He said charity galas without any particular emphasis, but Vanessa felt it anyway. The small, accidental sting of being grouped with the people who had destroyed his career. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be. I made a choice. I don't regret it. Do you miss it? Engineering? He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something behind the steadiness, a flash of something raw and hungry and quickly suppressed. Every day. They stood in silence for a moment. Somewhere above them, a concrete saw screamed through steel. I should get back to work, Ryan said. Right. Of course. Vanessa hesitated, then pulled a business card from her jacket pocket. She didn't know why she'd brought one. She never carried business cards to construction sites. If you ever want to talk about engineering or anything. He took the card, looked at it, and put it in his coverall pocket without comment. Thank you, Vanessa. She nodded and walked away, and she was halfway to the elevator bank before she realized her heart was beating fast again. Not from fear this time, not from the adrenaline of a stuck elevator or a structural crisis, but from something simpler and more terrifying. She had just met a man who told her the truth without being asked to, who helped people without expecting anything in return, and who looked at her like she was just a person standing in an unfinished building, not a brand, not a balance sheet, not a name on a Forbes list. Just a person. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at her that way. The following Saturday, Vanessa took Emma to the park. Not Central Park, too visible, too likely to attract photographers. A smaller park on the Upper West Side, near a playground that was slightly run down in the comfortable way that meant real families actually used it. Vanessa wore jeans, sneakers, and a baseball cap pulled low. No makeup, no security detail. Just a mother and her daughter, and a bench and a bag of pretzels from the bodega on the corner. Emma played on the monkey bars for 20 minutes while Vanessa sat and watched and tried to remember what it felt like to be a person who sat in parks on Saturday mornings. It felt foreign, like wearing someone else's clothes. Her phone buzzed. Charles Beaumont. Vanessa, I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to see if you'd be free for dinner Tuesday. There's a new place on the Upper East Side that I think you'd enjoy. Tuesday works, Vanessa said, watching Emma hang upside down from a bar with her braids dangling toward the ground. Wonderful. I'll make a reservation. 8 o'clock? 8 is fine. And Vanessa, I enjoyed our last conversation. Very much. I did too. She hung up and stared at the phone in her hand and tried to figure out why saying yes to dinner with Charles felt like signing a contract instead of accepting a date. A soccer ball rolled to a stop near her feet. Sorry. A small boy came running after it, sandy-haired, freckled, missing one of his front teeth, wearing a t-shirt that was inside out and sneakers that were untied. He grabbed the ball and looked up at Vanessa with the unapologetic directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to be intimidated by adults. Are you someone's mom? He asked. I am. That's my daughter over there. He turned to look at Emma on the monkey bars, then turned back to Vanessa. Does she want to play soccer? My dad says I need to practice passing because I'm what did he say? A ball hog, but I need someone to pass to. Before Vanessa could answer, a voice called from across the playground. Noah! Don't bother people. Vanessa looked up. Ryan was walking toward them, carrying 2 water bottles and wearing weekend clothes, jeans, a faded t-shirt, work boots that had seen better days. Without the coveralls and the flashlight, he looked different. Younger, maybe. Or just less guarded. He stopped when he saw Vanessa, blinked once. Hi, she said. Hi. He looked at Noah, then back at Vanessa. This is my son. He was recruiting my daughter for soccer practice. He does that. Noah, what did I tell you about asking strangers to play? You said to be polite about it. I was polite. Ryan looked at Vanessa with an expression that clearly said, you see what I'm dealing with. Emma, Vanessa called. Want to play soccer? Emma dropped from the monkey bars and jogged over. She looked at Noah. Noah looked at her. There was a brief, wordless negotiation of the kind that only happens between children, a rapid assessment of compatibility conducted entirely through eye contact and body language. I'm not very good, Emma said. That's okay, Noah said. I'm too good. It'll balance out. Emma narrowed her eyes. That's kind of rude. My dad says honesty is more important than politeness. Your dad is wrong. Am I? Ryan muttered, mostly to himself. The kids ran off with the ball. Vanessa moved over on the bench. Ryan sat down. Not close, not far. The distance of 2 people who didn't know each other well enough to be comfortable but were too tired to be formal. They watched the kids play in silence for a few minutes. Noah was, in fact, a ball hog. Emma was, in fact, not very good. But they figured it out, the way kids do, through argument, negotiation, and the occasional dramatic collapse onto the grass. I didn't expect to see you here, Ryan said. I didn't expect to be here. Rough week? Vanessa laughed. Short, surprised. Every week is a rough week. Right, billionaire problems. She looked at him. He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was a warmth around his eyes that softened the words. I have a structural engineering crisis on the Riverside project, she said. The HVAC loads don't match the original specs. We might have to tear out 3 floors of work and start over. She didn't know why she was telling him this. She didn't discuss proprietary construction problems with maintenance workers in public parks. But the words came out before the filter kicked in, and once they were out, she didn't want to take them back. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Which specs? The original Mercer and Holt drawings or the revised set from the city? Vanessa turned to face him fully. How do you know about the revised set? I've been working in that building for 8 months. I read the posted permits. The original load calculations assumed a different HVAC system, the lighter modular units. But the contractor switched to the integrated system midway through because it was cheaper to install. Different weight profile. You noticed that from the permits? I noticed it because the permit specs didn't match the equipment being delivered. Anyone with an engineering background would have caught it. Nobody with an engineering background did catch it. Nobody with an engineering background was looking at the basement-level permits. They were looking at the penthouse renderings. Vanessa stared at him. Are you telling me you already know what's wrong with my building? I'm telling you I have a theory, but I'm a maintenance worker, so nobody asked. The bitterness was there now. Just a trace, quickly covered, but there. Vanessa understood it. She'd spent enough years fighting for credibility in rooms where men assumed she didn't belong to recognize the particular exhaustion of being underestimated. I'm asking, she said. Ryan looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone, opened the Notes app, and started drawing a diagram with his finger. Crude, imprecise, but structurally legible. The east cantilever was designed for a distributed load of 42 pounds per square foot. The integrated HVAC system concentrates the load at the junction points instead of distributing it evenly. You don't need to tear out 3 floors. You need to add supplemental support brackets at 12 specific points along the cantilever and redistribute the ductwork routing to avoid the concentration zones. How long would that take? 3 weeks? Maybe 4. Fraction of the cost of a teardown. And you figured this out from the basement? I figured it out because I spent 5 years designing buildings, and I can't turn it off just because nobody's paying me to do it anymore. There was something in his voice when he said it. Not self-pity, not anger, just a raw, honest admission that the thing he was best at had been taken from him and he still carried it everywhere like a phantom limb. Vanessa looked at the diagram on his phone, looked at Ryan, looked at the playground where Emma and Noah were now sitting on the grass arguing about whether goalkeepers were allowed to use their hands in street soccer. Come to my office Monday morning, she said. What? Bring whatever notes you have on the load distribution issue. I'll have my chief engineer meet with you. I'm a maintenance worker. Your chief engineer isn't going to take a meeting with me. He will if I tell him to. Ryan studied her face as if checking for the catch. People like Vanessa always had a catch, an angle, an agenda, a reason why generosity came with strings. She could see him looking for it. He didn't find it. Okay, he said. Okay. They sat on the bench for another hour while the kids played and they talked. About the Riverside project, about engineering, about the particular insanity of building anything in Manhattan where the bedrock shifted every 3 blocks, and the permitting process was designed by people who had never held a hammer. Ryan was sharp, detailed, and occasionally funny in the dry, understated way of someone who had stopped trying to be charming and had accidentally become more interesting because of it. Vanessa found herself laughing more than she had in months. When it was time to leave, Emma and Noah exchanged a solemn handshake that they had apparently invented during their soccer game, a complicated sequence of fist bumps and finger snaps that neither of them could replicate consistently. Same time next week? Noah asked. Emma looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at Ryan. Same time next week, Ryan said. In the car on the way home, Emma was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Mom? Yeah? Ryan's different from the other ones. The other what? The other men, the ones Patricia picked. He's not one of those, Emma. He works at the construction site. I know, that's why he's different. Vanessa glanced at her daughter in the rear-view mirror. Emma was looking out the window, watching the city go by, her face carrying that expression of calm certainty that she'd inherited from David, the look that said she'd already made up her mind about something and was just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. On Monday morning, Ryan showed up at Whitmore Development headquarters at 8:45. He was wearing the cleanest clothes he owned, dark slacks, a button-down shirt that was slightly too big across the shoulders, shoes that had been polished recently enough to still look presentable. He carried a manila folder filled with handwritten calculations and a USB drive containing diagrams he'd made on free software on his son's school laptop. The security guard at the lobby desk looked at him the way security guards in 53-story corporate towers always looked at men who arrived without suits or appointments, with polite professional suspicion. "I have a meeting with Ms. Whitmore," Ryan said. "Your name?" "Ryan Carter." The guard checked a list, found the name, raised his eyebrows slightly, issued a visitor badge. Ryan rode the elevator to the 53rd floor and stepped out into a world that felt like another planet. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the East River, Italian marble floors, a reception desk that probably cost more than his annual salary. People in tailored clothes moving with the particular urgency of professionals who measured their time in 6-minute billing increments. He stood there for a moment, holding his manila folder, feeling the full weight of the distance between who he used to be and who he was now. "Ryan." Vanessa appeared from a glass-walled conference room, and she was different here. Not the woman on the park bench in jeans and a baseball cap, but the CEO version. The one who wore heels that added 3 inches and authority that added more. Her hair was down, her makeup was precise, and she moved through the office with the kind of gravity that made people step out of her way without being asked. But when she smiled at him, it was the same smile from the park. Warm. Slightly surprised, as if she hadn't expected him to actually show up. "Come in," she said. "I want you to meet someone." The chief engineer, a man named Douglas Pratt, was already in the conference room. Douglas was 58, beard going gray, decades of experience etched into his face in the form of permanent skepticism. He looked at Ryan the way a tenured professor looks at an undergraduate who has wandered into the wrong lecture hall. "Mr. Carter," Douglas said, not standing. "Vanessa tells me you have some thoughts about the East Cantilever." "I do." "Let's hear them." Ryan opened his manila folder and spread his handwritten calculations across the conference table. Douglas looked at the papers, at the pencil marks, the hand-drawn diagrams, the lack of professional formatting, and his expression tightened with something that wasn't quite condescension but lived in the same neighborhood. Ryan didn't flinch. He walked Douglas through the load distribution analysis, point by point, without rushing, without hedging, without the defensive preamble of a man trying to justify his credentials. He simply explained what was wrong and how to fix it, using the language of someone who had once spoken it fluently and had never forgotten it despite years of being told it wasn't his language to speak anymore. It took 12 minutes. When he finished, Douglas sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. "Where did you say you worked before?" Douglas asked. "Mercer and Holt." "The whistleblower case?" "Yes." Another silence. Douglas picked up one of the handwritten pages, held it at arm's length, and studied it with the particular intensity of a man who had just realized he was looking at something he hadn't expected to find. "These supplemental bracket calculations," Douglas said. "You accounted for thermal expansion variance." "I did." "Most engineers forget that. Most engineers aren't installing brackets on an east-facing cantilever with 12 hours of direct sun exposure." Douglas looked at Vanessa, then back at Ryan, then at the papers again. "This would work," he said. "The routing modifications would need to be verified on site, but the load math checks out." Vanessa leaned forward. "How long to implement?" 3, maybe 4 weeks. Compared to the teardown, we'd save, conservatively, 8 to 10 million and 2 months of schedule. The number hung in the room like a held breath. Ryan gathered his papers, tapped them into a neat stack, and put them back in the manila folder. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He just closed the folder and looked at Vanessa as if to say, "I told you." "Thank you, Ryan," Vanessa said. He nodded, stood, walked to the door. "Mr. Carter," Douglas said. Ryan turned. Douglas hesitated. The hesitation of a proud man about to say something that cost him. "That was good work." Ryan looked at him for a moment. Then he left. Vanessa watched him walk to the elevator, press the button, and wait with his manila folder under his arm, standing perfectly still in a lobby that was designed for people who looked nothing like him. The elevator doors opened. He stepped in. The doors closed. And Vanessa sat in her conference room surrounded by glass and marble and the faint smell of Italian leather. And she thought about a man who had once built towers and now fixed fuse boxes, who had lost everything because he refused to lie, and who had just saved her company $10 million with handwritten notes on paper he probably bought at a drugstore. She picked up her phone, put it down, picked it up again. She wasn't supposed to feel this. She had a system. She had a plan. She had Charles Beaumont and his Tuesday dinners and his appropriate widower grief and his perfect resume. But systems don't account for the way someone looks at you when they're not trying to sell you anything. Plans don't include the sound of a calm voice through an elevator door in the dark. And resumes don't measure the one thing that Emma had recognized immediately and that Vanessa was only now beginning to understand. Ryan Carter didn't try to belong in her world. He just showed up and did what needed to be done. And somehow, that was enough to make her entire world feel unsteady. The Tuesday dinner with Charles Beaumont was at a restaurant called Aurelio's on East 74th Street, the kind of place that didn't list prices on the menu because the clientele would find it insulting. White tablecloths, a sommelier who introduced himself by first name and knew Charles's preferences without asking. Candles that smelled faintly of cedar and money. Charles looked good. He always looked good. Navy suit, no tie, the top button undone in a way that was supposed to suggest relaxation, but felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in a mirror before leaving the house. He stood when Vanessa arrived, pulled out her chair, and ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than Ryan Carter's monthly rent, without pausing to consider whether the comparison had occurred to anyone else at the table. It had occurred to Vanessa. She hated that it had occurred to Vanessa. "You look wonderful," Charles said, settling back into his chair with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told he didn't belong in a room. "Thank you. You too. I heard about the Riverside project, the structural issue." Vanessa paused, her water glass halfway to her lips. "Where did you hear about that?" "Patricia mentioned it at the Harrington Quarterly Review this morning. Nothing specific, just that there had been a complication and it was being resolved." Patricia. Of course. Patricia talked to everyone. It was what made her an excellent COO and an exhausting human being. "It's being resolved," Vanessa confirmed. "By your engineering team?" "By someone with engineering expertise, yes." Charles smiled the warm, practiced smile that she'd admired at their first dinner and was now beginning to study more carefully. "Wonderful. The last thing you need is another delay on that project. Investors are already nervous." "Investors are always nervous. That's their job." "True." He leaned forward slightly. "Speaking of nervous, how is the other project going? The one that made headlines?" He meant Emma. He meant the public announcement about finding love. He was bringing it up with the same careful, measured tone he used for everything, concerned but not pushy, curious but not intrusive. Every word calibrated to feel natural while being anything but. "It's going," Vanessa said. "I imagine you've been inundated with candidates." Patricia made a list. Charles laughed. His warm, charming laugh. Of course she did. Patricia would optimize a sunset if someone gave her a spreadsheet. It was a good line. Vanessa smiled. She was supposed to smile. "Can I be direct with you?" Charles asked. "I'd prefer it. I know I'm on that list. I know this dinner is, in some way, an audition. And I want you to know that I'm not here because of any strategic interest. I'm not angling for a merger or a partnership or a board seat. I'm here because I find you genuinely remarkable. And I think we understand each other in a way that most people can't." It was the right thing to say. It was perfectly delivered. And Vanessa sat across from this handsome, wealthy, articulate widower who had said all the right words in the right order, and she felt absolutely nothing. Not nothing, nothing. She felt warmth, comfort, the mild, pleasant ease of being with someone who was easy to talk to and would never challenge her or confuse her or make her feel off balance. Charles was like a luxury hotel room, beautiful, expensive, impeccably maintained, and completely interchangeable with every other luxury hotel room in the world. "I appreciate you saying that, Charles." "But?" She looked at him. He was perceptive. She had to give him that. "No, but I'm figuring things out." "Take all the time you need." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his His palm was smooth and dry and perfectly manicured. It felt like shaking hands with a leather glove. Vanessa thought about Ryan's hand, calloused, rough from years of physical work, wiped hastily on coveralls before shaking hers, the grip that was firm without performing firmness. She pulled her hand back gently and picked up her wine glass. Charles didn't react. He was too polished to react. They talked for another hour about safe things. A new museum exhibit, a mutual acquaintance's divorce, the particular absurdity of Manhattan real estate, which was a topic Vanessa could discuss in her sleep. When the check came, Charles paid without looking at it. When they said goodnight on the sidewalk, he kissed her cheek, precisely, briefly, like stamping an envelope. In the car home, Vanessa called Margaret. "How's Emma?" "Asleep. She finished her homework and watched a movie. Noah's father called about an hour ago." Vanessa's hand tightened on the phone. "Ryan called?" "He called for Emma, actually. Something about a soccer rematch this Saturday. I told him I'd pass the message along." "Thank you, Margaret." She hung up and leaned her head against the car window and watched the city slide past. All those lights, all those windows, all those lives happening simultaneously in rooms she would never see. Somewhere out there, Ryan Carter was probably putting his son to bed in a studio apartment in Queens, reading from whatever book Noah was into this week, falling asleep on a couch that was too short because the bedroom belonged to the kid. And somewhere in this car, Vanessa Whitmore was coming home from a dinner that cost $300 and feeling lonelier than she had in years. The following week moved fast. Douglas Pratt's team began implementing Ryan's bracket solution on the East Cantilever, and the results were immediate. The load distribution numbers came back within safety margins at every test point. Frank called Vanessa on Thursday to report that they were ahead of even Ryan's projected timeline. "The guy knows what he's doing," Frank said, with the grudging admiration of a project manager who had been proven wrong. "We're going to save closer to $12 million when you factor in the avoided delays." Vanessa forwarded the report to the board. She did not mention Ryan's name. She credited the fix to an engineering consultation and let the numbers speak for themselves. It wasn't a kindness. It was a calculation. If the board knew that the solution came from a maintenance worker, a blacklisted whistleblower, the political complications would overshadow the financial ones. Marcus Webb would ask questions. Patricia would want to manage the narrative. Charles, who sat on Harrington Capital's investment committee, would hear about it within hours. So Vanessa kept Ryan's involvement quiet. She told herself it was to protect him. But a small, uncomfortable part of her knew it was also to protect herself. From the questions people would ask about why she was spending time with a man who fixed fuse boxes for a living, and why she couldn't stop thinking about him. Saturday came. The park again. This time, Vanessa didn't pretend it was an accident. She texted Ryan on Friday night, the number from his file, which she'd had Gerald pull under the pretense of a contractor follow-up, and asked if the soccer rematch was still on. His response came 20 minutes later. "Noah's been practicing. Tell Emma to bring her game." She smiled at her phone for longer than she'd admit to anyone. The park was busier this Saturday. Warmer weather pulling families out of their apartments and into the patchy sunlight of early spring. Vanessa brought sandwiches from a deli she used to go to with David, back when they lived in the neighborhood and couldn't afford anything better. Turkey and Swiss on rye, extra mustard, pickles on the side. The kind of sandwich that cost $6 and tasted better than anything Aurelio's had ever put on a plate. Ryan was already there when they arrived, sitting on their bench. She'd started thinking of it as their bench, which was absurd, and she knew it. Watching Noah kick the soccer ball against a tree with the focused intensity of a child preparing for war. "He's been talking about this all week," Ryan said as Vanessa sat down. "So has Emma. Should we be worried?" "Probably." The kids found each other immediately, and within 5 minutes they were in the middle of the field, arguing about rules, laughing about something the adults couldn't hear, existing in that private world that children create effortlessly, and adults spend their whole lives trying to find again. Vanessa handed Ryan a sandwich. He looked at it, then at her. "You brought me lunch?" "I brought sandwiches. You happened to be here." He unwrapped it, took a bite, and chewed thoughtfully. "This is a good sandwich, Sek." "I know." "Where's it from?" "Morelli's on Amsterdam." I know Morelli's. I used to live 6 blocks from there. When? Before. When I was still at Mercer and Holt. I had an apartment on West 82nd. He took another bite. Small, terrible plumbing, incredible light in the mornings. Noah learned to walk in the living room. Vanessa tried to imagine it. Ryan in a different life, coming home from an engineering firm to a real apartment with morning light, watching his son take first steps across a floor that he'd probably measured for square footage out of professional habit. "What happened to Noah's mother?" she asked. The question came out before she could decide whether it was too personal, and she braced for him to shut down the way he did when conversations got close to the parts of his life he'd walled off. But he didn't shut down. He just chewed his sandwich for a moment, looking at the kids on the field. Sarah left when Noah was 2. It wasn't dramatic. She just realized she wasn't ready to be a mother. She'd been honest about that from the beginning, actually, and I'd been dishonest with myself about hearing it. I kept thinking she'd come around. She didn't. Does Noah see her? Twice a year, birthdays and Christmas. She sends good gifts. She's not a bad person. She's just not a parent. That must be hard for him. It was. It's getting easier. Or he's getting better at hiding it. Hard to tell with 8-year-olds. They were quiet for a while. Not the uncomfortable silence of two people who'd run out of things to say, but the companionable silence of two people who had enough shared weight to sit with it without needing to fill every second with words. David died in a car accident, Vanessa said. Ryan looked at her. He was coming home from a meeting. Some developer he was trying to convince to include green space in a residential project. He was always doing that, fighting for parks, for trees, for places where kids could play. The other driver ran a red light. David was gone before the ambulance arrived. She said it flatly, the way she always said it, the facts stripped of emotion, delivered like a press release. She'd told this story so many times that she'd worn the edges smooth, and now it came out like a polished stone, hard and neat, and completely disconnected from the screaming, shattered reality of the night it actually happened. Emma was 4, Vanessa continued, old enough to understand that Daddy wasn't coming home, too young to understand why. She kept setting a place for him at dinner, every night for 3 months. I'd clear it after she went to bed. Then one morning she woke up and didn't set it anymore. She just stopped. And we never talked about it. You never talked about it? I didn't know how. I was 24 years old. I had a company that was barely surviving. I had a daughter who'd lost her father, and I had no idea how to do any of it. So I just kept moving. I worked. I built. I hired people who were smarter than me, and I outworked every single one of them until the company was big enough that nobody could question whether I deserved to be there. And Emma? Emma raised herself mostly. Margaret helped. Good schools helped. But the real parenting, the sitting down and talking about hard things kind, I missed most of that. I was in meetings. I was on planes. I was negotiating deals at 2 a.m. because the Tokyo office was 14 hours ahead and I couldn't afford to lose the contract. She paused, looked at Ryan. His face was doing that thing again, the thing that scared her more than any boardroom confrontation she'd ever faced. He was just listening, not formulating a response, not preparing advice, not composing his expression into appropriate sympathy, just listening the way you listen to rain, with your whole body, without judgment, without needing it to stop. The night of the gala, Vanessa said, when Emma grabbed that microphone, she wasn't just asking for a father, she was asking me to stop running. Did you? I'm trying. Ryan nodded once. Trying counts. There was a burst of shrieking laughter from the field. They both looked up. Noah was lying on the ground with the soccer ball on his stomach, and Emma was standing over him with her hands on her hips, apparently having won some dispute through sheer force of personality. She's a lot like you, Ryan said. Emma? No, she's like David. She's got his eyes, his stubbornness, his way of deciding something and then just waiting until reality catches up. She's got your spine, though. That kid is not afraid of anything. She's afraid of the dark. Everyone's afraid of the dark. But she sat in that elevator and counted to 431. That's not a scared kid. That's a brave kid who happens to be scared. Vanessa felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, not shatter, just crack, the way ice cracks on a pond when the temperature shifts by a single degree. a hairline fracture in the wall she'd built so carefully over 6 years. Ryan. Yeah? She didn't know what she was going to say. She'd started his name without a sentence behind it, which was something she never did. Vanessa Whitmore always knew the end of her sentences before she said the beginning. I really like this sandwich, she said. He looked at her for a beat. Then he laughed. A real laugh. Not polished or practiced or carefully calibrated. The kind of laugh that started in the belly and surprised even the person making it. Yeah, he said. Me too. The calls from Charles continued through the following week. A text on Sunday morning. Hope you're having a restful weekend. A voicemail on Monday afternoon. Just checking in. Nothing urgent. A flower delivery on Wednesday. White lilies, elegant, expensive, with a card that read, Thinking of you. C. Vanessa put the lilies on her desk. They were beautiful. They were exactly the kind of gesture that was supposed to work. On Thursday, Charles called with something different. I have 2 tickets to the Met Opera benefit on Saturday evening. I know it's short notice, but I thought of you immediately. Vanessa stared at the calendar on her screen. Saturday, the park, the bench, sandwiches. I'll check my schedule, she said. Of course. Let me know. She put the phone down and sat very still. The right choice was Charles. She knew that. Charles was appropriate. Charles made sense. Charles understood her world because he lived in it. Charles would be accepted by the board, embraced by investors, approved by Patricia, featured alongside Vanessa on the kind of magazine covers that made powerful people more powerful. Ryan was the wrong choice. Ryan lived in a studio apartment. Ryan worked for $11 an hour more than minimum wage. Ryan's name had been dragged through professional mud so thoroughly that putting it next to hers would invite the kind of scrutiny that could destabilize everything she'd built. She knew all of this. She called Ryan. Hey, he said, and even on the phone his voice had that quality, steady, warm, surprised, like someone who hadn't expected to be called but was glad he was. Are you free Saturday? Vanessa asked. I'm always free Saturday. That's the benefit of having no money and no social life. I wanted to do something different. Instead of the park, I thought maybe the 4 of us could go somewhere. The Natural History Museum, maybe. Emma's been asking about the dinosaur exhibit. A pause. She could hear Noah in the background saying something about a video game. The 4 of us, Ryan repeated. If that's okay. Vanessa, are we? It's the museum. With our kids. Right. The museum. Saturday at 10. Saturday at 10. She hung up, and her heart was doing the thing again. The fast, stupid, terrifying thing that she hadn't felt since she was 22, and a man with a lopsided grin kept coming back to a coffee shop for terrible empanadas. She picked up the phone and texted Charles. Can't make Saturday. Rain check? His response came in 30 seconds. Of course. Another time. Polite. Understanding. Appropriate. Everything Ryan wasn't. The museum was Emma's idea in the original sense. She'd been asking to go for weeks, but the reality of the outing was something more complicated and charged than any of them acknowledged out loud. It was the first time Vanessa and Ryan had done something together that wasn't an accident or a construction site crisis or a coincidence at the park. This was planned. This was deliberate. This was the 4 of them walking through marble halls surrounded by ancient bones, and it felt to Vanessa like the most terrifying thing she'd done since standing on that gala stage. Emma and Noah raced ahead through the fossil wing, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings, arguing about whether a T-Rex could beat a Triceratops in a fight, a debate that had apparently been ongoing since their first soccer game and showed no signs of resolution. Noah says the T-Rex wins because it has bigger teeth, Emma reported, circling back to where Vanessa and Ryan were standing in front of a Stegosaurus skeleton. But I said the Triceratops has horns and a shield on its face, so it could block the bite. She makes a solid point, Ryan said. Dad, you're supposed to be on my side. I'm on the side of scientific accuracy. Triceratops had excellent defensive capabilities. Noah threw his hands up and stalked back to the exhibit, muttering about betrayal. Emma followed, looking smug. They're going to be friends for life or kill each other, Ryan said. Possibly both. They walked slowly through the exhibits, stopping when the kids stopped, moving when the kids moved. Ryan knew a surprising amount about paleontology, a leftover interest from a childhood spent reading every book in the Queen's Public Library. He explained plate tectonics to Noah using a museum map and 2 postcards from the gift shop. He pointed out where the fossil reconstructions were based on actual bones versus plaster casts, and Emma immediately wanted to know how you could tell the difference. "Wait," Ryan said, lifting her up so she could see the top of a display case. "Real bone is heavier. The plaster ones are smoother too. Real fossils have texture, little ridges, and pits from millions of years of being squeezed by rock." "How do you know all this?" Emma asked. "I used to want to be a paleontologist before I got into engineering." "Why'd you switch?" "Because paleontologists don't make much money, and my mom needed help with rent." He said it simply, without bitterness, the way he said most things about his past, as facts that belonged to a different version of himself. In the gift shop, Noah wanted a stuffed triceratops. Ryan looked at the price tag, $28, and Vanessa saw the quick calculation flash across his face, the mental arithmetic of a man who budgeted every dollar. "I'll get it," Vanessa said quietly. Ryan's expression shifted. Not anger, something more fragile than anger. Pride, maybe. The particular kind of pride that comes from having nothing and needing to prove you don't need anything. "I can buy my kid a toy, Vanessa." "I know you can. But Emma wants the T-Rex, and I'm buying that, so let me get Noah's too. It's not what?" She heard it. The edge in his voice, the first real friction between them. The gap that money created, visible now in a way it hadn't been on a park bench with $6 sandwiches. "It's a stuffed dinosaur, Ryan. Not a car." He held her gaze for a moment. Then something in his jaw relaxed, and he exhaled through his nose. "Fine, but I'm buying lunch." "Fair." He bought lunch at a hot dog cart outside the museum. 4 hot dogs, 4 sodas, and a soft pretzel that they split 4 ways on the museum steps, while the kids made their dinosaurs fight each other. It was the best meal Vanessa had had in weeks, and it cost less than the appetizer at Aurelio's. Later, walking back toward the subway, Emma and Noah ran ahead, racing each other to the entrance, their laughter bouncing off the brownstone walls. "I want to offer you something," Vanessa said, "and I need you to hear me out before you say no." Ryan looked at her sideways. "That's never a good opening." Douglas Pratt needs a consulting engineer for the rest of the Riverside project. Someone who understands the structural issues and can oversee the bracket installation. The pay is real, the title is real, and it's based entirely on the work you've already done. I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a job that you're the most qualified person in the city to do. Ryan stopped walking. "I know what you're going to say," Vanessa continued. "You're going to say it looks bad. You're going to say people will think I'm giving you a job because of whatever this is between us. And maybe some people will think that. But Douglas signed off on the hire. He doesn't do favors for anyone. He wants you because you're good." Ryan stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the closed door thing. Not locked, but closed. Processing. "If I take this job," he said slowly, "and people find out about us, there is no us. Not officially." He looked at her. "Not officially. Not yet." The word hung between them, and Vanessa felt the blood rush to her face in a way that was completely inappropriate for a 30-year-old billionaire standing on a public sidewalk in broad daylight. "I need to think about it," Ryan said. "Take your time." "And Vanessa, if I say yes, it's because of the work, not because of you." "I know. I mean it. I'm not going to be the guy who got a job because the CEO likes him. I've already been the guy who lost a job because the partners didn't. I can't do that again." "You won't have to." He studied her face the way he'd studied the load calculations, carefully, thoroughly, looking for the flaw that would bring the whole structure down. Whatever he found, it was enough. "I'll think about it," he said again. Then he called to Noah, and the two of them disappeared down the subway stairs, and Vanessa stood on the sidewalk watching them go, holding a stuffed T-Rex in one hand and a feeling in her chest that she hadn't felt in 6 years. She had a board meeting in the morning. She had a conference call with Tokyo at midnight. She had 27 unread emails from Patricia and a voicemail from Charles that she hadn't listened to yet. But standing there on the sidewalk, watching a man and his son walk down into the ordinary underground world of trains and crowds and everyday noise, Vanessa Whitmore, the woman who ran a $4 billion empire and controlled every variable in her life with surgical precision, realized she had no idea what was going to happen next. And for the first time in 6 years, that didn't feel like failure. It felt like the beginning of something she wasn't ready for, but was tired of being too afraid to want. Ryan said yes on a Monday. He called Vanessa at 7 in the morning before she'd finished her coffee, before Gerald had arrived with the day's schedule, before the city had fully woken up and started demanding things from her. His voice was quiet. Noah was still sleeping. And he said it simply, the way he said most important things. I'll take the job, but I have conditions. Name them. I report to Douglas, not to you. I don't get special treatment. I don't get a corner office or a company car or anything that makes people think I'm there for any reason other than the work. And if I'm wrong about something, well, if my calculations don't hold up, if I make a mistake, Douglas fires me the same way he'd fire anyone else. No protection. Agreed. One more thing. What? We don't talk about this. About us, whatever this is, at the office. Not until the project is done. I need to earn this on my own terms. Vanessa set her coffee down. Ryan, you already earned it. You saved us $12 million with a manila folder. I know what I did, but nobody else knows I did it. And if they find out, I need them to see the work first, not the story. She understood. She hated it. The patience, the restraint, the idea of standing next to him in a conference room and pretending she didn't think about him when she was alone. But she understood. Okay, she said. Okay. He started the following Wednesday. Douglas gave him a desk in the engineering bullpen on the 41st floor, a gray cubicle with a shared printer and a view of the building across the street. No window, no nameplate, just a stack of blueprints, a computer login, and the particular anonymity of a man who had entered from the bottom of an organization that didn't know what to do with him. The other engineers were suspicious. Ryan could feel it the way you feel weather changing, a shift in atmospheric pressure, conversations that paused when he walked past, the careful politeness that people extend to someone they haven't decided about yet. He knew what they saw. A maintenance worker who'd somehow jumped the ladder into a consulting role, a guy with no recent professional references, no LinkedIn profile worth mentioning, and a resume with a 4-year gap that screamed trouble to anyone who bothered to read between the lines. He kept his head down. He did the work. The bracket installation on the East Cantilever was proceeding on schedule, but Ryan found 2 additional problems within his first week. A drainage routing error on the 28th floor that would have caused water damage within 2 years of occupancy, and a miscalculation in the fire suppression system's pipe diameter that violated city code by a margin slim enough to pass inspection, but wide enough to matter in an actual emergency. He brought both issues to Douglas with documentation, calculations, and proposed solutions. Douglas reviewed them in silence, nodded once, and sent the corrections to Frank's team without comment. By the end of the second week, the other engineers had stopped being suspicious and started being curious. Ryan answered their questions without showing off, helped with problems without being asked, and ate lunch alone at his desk because he hadn't figured out the social dynamics yet and didn't want to force his way into a group that wasn't sure about him. On Friday of that second week, a young structural engineer named Lisa Nguyen stopped at his cubicle. "You're the guy who caught the cantilever thing," she said. It wasn't a question. "I noticed an inconsistency in the load specs. Douglas said you did the bracket calculations by hand, on paper. I didn't have access to the modeling software at the time." Lisa stared at him with the expression of someone who had just watched a person solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded. "We're going to O'Malley's after work. You should come." "I have to pick up my son." "Next week, then." "Maybe." She walked away, and Ryan sat in his cubicle and stared at his screen and felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. The faint, fragile sensation of being seen as a professional again. It was so small and so enormous at the same time that he didn't know what to do with it, so he went back to work and pretended it hadn't happened. Meanwhile, 12 floors above him, Charles Beaumont was having lunch with Marcus Webb. This was not unusual. Charles and Marcus moved in the same circles, sat on adjacent boards, attended the same benefits. What was unusual was the topic. Have you noticed anything different about Vanessa lately? Marcus asked, cutting into a steak that was bleeding onto his plate in a way he found satisfying. Charles set down his fork. Different how? Distracted. She missed the quarterly forecast meeting last Thursday, first time in 7 years. Patricia covered, but Patricia isn't Vanessa. She's got a lot on her mind. The gala announcement, the Riverside project, the media attention. It's not the media attention. Vanessa eats media attention for breakfast. Something else is going on. Charles was quiet for a moment. He'd noticed it too. The last 2 times he'd called Vanessa, she'd been pleasant but brief. The kind of brief that meant her attention was somewhere else. The Saturday opera tickets she'd declined. The dinner reservation she'd postponed twice. I hear there's a new hire on the Riverside engineering team, Marcus said, in the particular tone of a man who already knew more than he was letting on. Someone unusual. Unusual how? A former maintenance worker. Jumped straight to consulting engineer on Douglas Pratt's team. No interview panel, no standard vetting process. Just a direct hire, signed off by Vanessa personally. Charles picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down with precision. Do we have a name? Ryan Carter. Ring any bells? No. He's the Mercer and Holt whistleblower, the one who blew up their inspection fraud case 4 years ago, got blacklisted from every engineering firm in the state. And Vanessa hired him. Vanessa hired him, directly, bypassing every normal HR process. Charles looked at Marcus, and something shifted between them. The unspoken recognition of 2 men who understood power and its vulnerabilities. What are you suggesting? Charles asked. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm observing. And what I'm observing is that our CEO is making unusual personnel decisions during a period of unusual personal behavior, and the 2 might be connected. Connected how? Marcus shrugged. The elaborate theatrical shrug of a man who wanted to plant a seed without fingerprints. I just think someone should look into it, for the company's protection. Charles stared at his plate for a long time after Marcus left. The steak had gone cold. He didn't feel jealous. Charles Beaumont didn't get jealous. Jealousy was an emotion for men who had something to lose, and Charles had spent his entire life ensuring that he never lost anything. What he felt was something colder and more strategic, the recognition that a variable had entered the equation that he hadn't accounted for, and variables like that needed to be managed. He pulled out his phone and called a number he hadn't used in months. Philip, it's Charles. I need a background file on someone. Full workup. Ryan Carter, formerly of Mercer and Holt Engineering. Everything you can find, quickly. The file arrived in Charles's inbox 3 days later, 47 pages. Employment history, financial records, court filings from the whistleblower case, custody documents, credit reports. The forensic anatomy of a man's entire life, laid out in cold, organized detail. Charles read it carefully, twice. Then he picked up his phone and called Patricia Huang. Patricia, I need a private meeting, just the 2 of us. It's about the Riverside project. Patricia, who never turned down information from a board-adjacent executive, agreed immediately. They met at a coffee shop in Midtown, neutral territory, away from the office, the kind of place where conversations happened without records. I'm going to share something with you, Charles said, sliding a folder across the table. And I want to be clear that I'm doing this out of concern for Vanessa and for the company. Patricia opened the folder. She read for 5 minutes without speaking. Ryan Carter accessed Vanessa's proprietary construction database on 3 occasions last week, Charles said. The login records show he downloaded structural specifications, cost analyses, and vendor contracts that go well beyond the scope of his consulting role. Patricia looked up. These access logs, where did you get them? I have sources inside the IT department. These could be routine. If he's working on the cantilever project, he'd need access to related specs. He downloaded vendor contracts, Patricia, financial documents, pricing agreements with suppliers. Why would a structural consultant need vendor pricing data? Patricia closed the folder. Her face had gone carefully neutral, the expression of a woman who was processing information without committing to a conclusion. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that we investigate. Quietly. If Ryan Carter is accessing confidential financial data without authorization, that's a security breach. If he's sharing that data with anyone, competitors, journalists, the people who prosecuted his former employer, it could be catastrophic. Have you talked to Vanessa about this? I can't talk to Vanessa about this. She's personally involved with this man. She hired him herself. If I go to her directly, she'll see it as an attack and shut down any investigation before it starts. Patricia was quiet for a long time. She was thinking about the board, about liability, about the optics of a CEO who was romantically involved with an employee she'd personally hired, an employee with a history of blowing the whistle on corporate misconduct, an employee who was now accessing financial data he shouldn't have. I'll take it to Marcus, Patricia said. I think that's wise. And Charles, if this turns out to be nothing, if Carter's access was legitimate and authorized, this conversation never happened. Of course. But Charles already knew it wouldn't turn out to be nothing, because the access logs he'd given Patricia weren't exactly accurate. They were real logs, but they'd been modified, timestamps shifted, file names changed, download records inflated. Philip's people were very good at that kind of thing, the kind of subtle alteration that looked authentic under casual review, but told a very different story from the truth. The truth was that Ryan Carter had accessed only the files directly related to his engineering work. He hadn't touched vendor contracts or financial data. He hadn't downloaded anything beyond the scope of his role. But the modified logs said otherwise. And by the time anyone thought to verify the originals, Charles would have already accomplished what he needed, the removal of Ryan Carter from Vanessa Whitmore's life. The call came on a Thursday. Ryan was at his desk, working through the fire suppression pipe calculations for the 20th floor, when Douglas Pratt appeared at his cubicle with an expression that Ryan recognized immediately. He'd seen it before, on the face of his supervisor at Mercer & Holt, on the faces of the partners who'd offered him money, on the face of every person who had ever delivered bad news while trying to look like it wasn't personal. Ryan, conference room, now. The conference room held 3 people, Douglas, Patricia Huang, and a woman from HR whose name Ryan didn't catch because his ears were ringing. Patricia did the talking. She was precise and clinical, the way she always was, the way she'd been trained to be. Mr. Carter, a review of our IT access logs has revealed that you downloaded proprietary financial documents, specifically vendor contracts and cost analyses, that fall outside the scope of your consulting agreement. This constitutes a potential breach of your confidentiality agreement and company security protocols. Ryan stared at her. I didn't download any financial documents. The logs indicate otherwise. Then the logs are wrong. Patricia slid a printout across the table. Ryan looked at it. Timestamps, file names, download records, his login, his credentials. Files he had never opened, listed in black and white as if they were facts. This is not what I did, he said. His voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness, something was crumbling. I accessed structural specs for the cantilever project and the fire suppression system. That's it. I've never opened a vendor contract in my life. The digital record shows otherwise, Mr. Carter. The digital record is wrong. Douglas spoke for the first time. His voice was carefully neutral, but Ryan could see the conflict in his eyes. The struggle of a man who had watched Ryan's work for 2 weeks and knew what he was capable of, trying to reconcile that with the paper in front of him. Ryan, we have to take this seriously. Pending a full investigation, you're suspended from all project work. Your access credentials have been revoked. You're not to enter the building or contact any Whitmore development employees regarding company business. Ryan looked at Douglas for a long moment. Then he stood up, picked up the printout, and folded it carefully into his pocket. I didn't do this, he said. Nobody responded. He walked out of the conference room, past the engineering bullpen where Lisa Nguyen looked up from her desk with confusion on her face, past the elevator bank where the security guard was already waiting to escort him out of the building, past the marble lobby where he had stood 3 weeks ago holding a manila folder and feeling, for the first time in 4 years, like he might be allowed to be an engineer again. The glass doors closed behind him. The city swallowed him up. And Ryan stood on the sidewalk in his button-down shirt that was still slightly too big across the shoulders and felt the ground shift beneath his feet the same way it had shifted 4 years ago when another company had taken everything he'd built and turned it to rubble because he'd made the mistake of telling the truth. He called Vanessa from a bench 2 blocks away. She answered on the second ring. "Ryan, I just heard. Patricia told me 10 minutes ago. I'm looking into it right now."
"I didn't do it, Vanessa. I know." "You know? I know you. I know your work. I know that you spent 2 weeks doing everything by the book because you wanted to earn this on your own terms. You didn't steal financial documents. Then what happened?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." Her voice had changed. Not the warm, slightly uncertain voice from park benches and museum steps, but the CEO voice, the one that had negotiated billion-dollar deals and stared down rooms full of men who underestimated her. The voice that was sharp enough to cut glass and steady enough to hold the weight of a company on its syllables. "Stay home," she said. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't post anything online. Don't call anyone at the company. Let me handle this." "Vanessa, I can't just—" "Ryan, let me handle this." He sat on the bench for a long time after she hung up.
The city moved around him, taxis, pedestrians, a man selling hot dogs on the corner, a woman yelling into her phone about something that sounded desperately important and completely insignificant at the same time. He thought about Noah, who was at school right now, sitting in a third-grade classroom, learning fractions, unaware that his father's life had just been upended for the second time. He thought about Emma, who would ask where Ryan was when Saturday came and he wasn't at the park. He thought about the manila folder that was still sitting in his apartment, on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, full of handwritten calculations that had saved a building from failure and a company from catastrophe and hadn't saved him from anything at all. That evening, Ryan picked Noah up from after-school care and took him to the diner on their block. The one with the cracked vinyl booths and the waitress who always gave Noah extra pickles without being asked. "How was school?" Ryan asked, the way he asked every day, even when the answer was always some version of fine. "Fine. We did fractions. I got a 92. "That's great, buddy." "Dad?" "Yeah? Are you okay? You look weird." Ryan looked at his son across the table. 8 years old. Front teeth that had grown in slightly crooked, giving him a smile that was imperfect and wonderful, and so much like Sarah's that sometimes it hurt to look at. A kid who had already learned by the age of 8 to read his father's face for signs of trouble. "I'm fine," Ryan said. "That's what you said last time, before we moved." Ryan closed his eyes for a second. "This isn't like last time." "Promise?" "I promise." But sitting in that diner booth, watching his son eat a grilled cheese sandwich and worry about things no 8-year-old should have to worry about, Ryan Carter wasn't sure he could keep that promise. He'd been here before, falsely accused, publicly discredited, watching his professional life collapse in slow motion while the people who orchestrated it sat in expensive restaurants and pretended their hands were clean. The difference was that last time he'd been alone. This time, somewhere across the city, a woman he barely knew and couldn't stop thinking about was fighting for him. He just didn't know if that would be enough. 2 floors above the conference room where Ryan had been suspended, in an office that smelled faintly of white lilies, Vanessa Whitmore sat at her desk and stared at the access logs until her eyes burned. Something was wrong. She couldn't prove it yet. The logs looked legitimate. Timestamps, file names, credential records, all formatted correctly, all internally consistent. On the surface, they told a simple story. Ryan Carter had abused his access privileges. But Vanessa had built a $4 billion company on the ability to read surfaces and see the architecture underneath, and these logs had architecture. They were too clean, too complete, too perfectly damning. Real mistakes were messy. Real breaches were sloppy. People who stole documents did it hastily, at odd hours, with patterns that reflected panic rather than precision. These logs showed a man calmly, methodically downloading sensitive files during business hours, as if he wanted to be caught. Ryan Carter was many things. Stupid was not one of them. Vanessa opened her laptop, pulled up the IT department's raw server records, and started digging. It was going to be a long night. Vanessa didn't sleep that night. She sat at her desk with 3 monitors open. The modified access logs Patricia had presented, the raw server data from IT, and a timeline she was building by hand on a legal pad, the way Ryan would have done it, one line at a time, because sometimes the old methods caught things the digital ones missed. By 2 in the morning, she'd found the first crack. The modified logs showed Ryan downloading a vendor contract called WDG-vendor-pricing-Q3-consolidated.xlsx at 2:47 p.m. on Tuesday. But the raw server data showed something different. At 2:47 p.m. on Tuesday, Ryan's credentials had been used to access a structural load file for the fire suppression system on the 20th floor. The file names were different. The timestamps matched, but the content didn't. Someone had swapped the file names in the access record. By 3:30, she'd found 4 more discrepancies. All followed the same pattern. Legitimate engineering files replaced with financial document names in the modified log. Timestamps preserved to maintain the appearance of authenticity. It was careful work, professional work. The kind of alteration that required access to the IT system's administrative layer, which meant either someone inside the IT department had done it, or someone with enough influence to compel an IT employee had ordered it done. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and pressed her knuckles against her eyes until she saw spots. Who had access to administrative IT functions? A short list. Gerald, as communications director, had read only access. Patricia had full administrative rights. Marcus Webb, as a board member, had oversight access through the audit committee. And Charles Beaumont, through Harrington Capital's investment monitoring agreement, had access to financial system logs as part of his fiduciary role. Charles. She didn't want it to be Charles. Charles was polished and appropriate and had said all the right things about understanding loss and building new beginnings. Charles had kissed her cheek on a sidewalk and sent white lilies and been everything that a reasonable, sensible choice was supposed to be. But Charles also sat on Harrington's investment committee. Charles had lunch with Marcus Webb regularly. Charles had the connections to hire someone who could modify access logs without leaving fingerprints. And Charles had something to lose. Vanessa picked up her phone, scrolled to a contact she hadn't used in months, and typed a message. I need IT forensics on the Riverside Project access logs. Full audit. Compare the modified records Patricia received against the raw server data. Report directly to me. No one else sees this. She sent it to James Okafor, the head of Whitmore Development's cybersecurity team, a man she'd hired away from the FBI 3 years ago, specifically because he was the kind of person who didn't care about office politics, didn't answer to anyone but her, and could trace a digital fingerprint through 6 layers of obfuscation. Then she put her phone down and sat in the dark office, alone, surrounded by the skyline that she'd spent a decade conquering, and she thought about Ryan sitting on a bench 2 blocks away with his world collapsing around him for the second time. She thought about Emma, who would ask about Saturday. She thought about Noah, who had already learned to read his father's face for trouble, and she thought about what it meant that the man she was supposed to choose, the appropriate man, the safe man, the man who fit, might be the one trying to destroy the man she actually wanted. James Okafor delivered his report on Saturday morning. He came to Vanessa's apartment, not the office, not a neutral location, but her apartment, because what he'd found was the kind of thing that needed to be said in a room without recording devices or glass walls. He was a tall, serious man who wore the same style of gray suit every day and spoke with the flat precision of someone who dealt in facts and found opinions wasteful. The access logs were modified, he said, standing in her living room while Emma ate cereal at the kitchen counter 10 feet away. The original server data shows Carter accessing only engineering files within his authorized scope. Someone with administrative access overwrote the file reference names in the duplicate log that was presented to Patricia Huang. Can you tell who? The modification was routed through an external VPN, which means it wasn't done from inside the building. But the administrative credentials used belonged to a service account that's shared between 3 authorized users, Patricia Huang, Marcus Webb's audit liaison, and the Harrington Capital monitoring portal. Harrington Capital. Yes. Vanessa felt the pieces click into place with the sickening precision of a lock turning. Can you prove which user made the modification? Not definitively through the credentials alone, but I pulled the VPN connection records,
and the external IP address traces back to a cybersecurity consulting firm called Arden Phillips Associates. They're a boutique firm that does corporate intelligence work, high-end, discreet. Who are their clients? Their client list is confidential, but I found one public reference. They provided expert testimony in a patent dispute for Harrington Capital 2 years ago. Vanessa looked at James.
James looked back with the patient expression of a man who had laid out the evidence and was waiting for the conclusion to arrive on its own. Thank you, James. I need you to compile everything into a formal report. Time-stamped, verified, everything documented. How soon? The Whitmore Investor Retreat is next Thursday. James raised an eyebrow. The most emotion she'd ever seen from him. You're going to do this publicly? I'm going to do this in front of every person who matters. James nodded once and left. Vanessa stood in her living room and felt the familiar rush. Not of anger, not exactly, but of the cold, focused clarity that came over her when she was about to go to war. She'd felt it before. When banks told her the waterfront project was impossible, when competitors tried to undercut her bids, when men in boardrooms assumed she was there to take notes instead of chair the meeting. She'd always fought for her company. Now she was fighting for something else.
Mom? Emma appeared in the living room doorway, holding her cereal bowl. Is Ryan coming to the park today? Vanessa looked at her daughter, the braids, David's eyes, the face that carried more understanding than any 10-year-old should have to carry. Not today, sweetheart. Why not? Something happened at work, but I'm fixing it. Emma studied her mother with that look, the one that said she was reading between the lines, the way kids do when adults think they're being subtle. Is someone being mean to him? Something like that. Is it the same thing that happened before? At his old job? Vanessa felt her throat tighten. How do you know about that? Noah told me. He said his dad lost his job because he told the truth and people got mad. That's basically what happened, yes. Emma set her cereal bowl on the side table with careful precision. Then you have to help him, because the last time, nobody helped. Vanessa looked at her daughter and realized, with a clarity that felt like being hit, that Emma understood something most adults spent their entire lives avoiding. That doing the right thing only works if someone is willing to stand next to you while you do it. I will, Vanessa said. I promise. Real promise? Not an after promise? Real promise. The Whitmore Development Annual Investor Retreat was held at the Ashford Estate in Connecticut, a 100-acre property that the company had purchased 3 years ago for corporate events. Rolling lawns, old stone buildings, the kind of understated wealth that whispered instead of shouted. 200 people attended. Board members, institutional investors, development partners, senior executives, and their assorted spouses and assistants. Patricia had organized the agenda. Morning panels on market forecasts, an afternoon session on the Riverside Project's progress, and an evening reception in the main hall. Charles Beaumont arrived at noon, looking impeccable as always. He found Vanessa in the garden, reviewing her notes for the afternoon session. You look focused, he said, smiling. I am. Everything all right? I heard about the Carter situation. Terrible business. Vanessa looked at him. She kept her expression neutral, the face she used in negotiations, the face that gave away nothing. It's being handled, she said. Good. The last thing you need is a security breach on top of everything else. He touched her arm lightly. If there's anything I can do, I appreciate that, Charles. He searched her face for something. Reassurance, maybe, or confirmation that she was still the woman who'd accepted his dinner invitations and allowed him to believe he was the frontrunner in a race he'd assumed he was winning. Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. I should get inside, Vanessa said. The afternoon session starts in 20 minutes. The main hall was a converted barn. Exposed beams, stone floors, tall windows that let in the September light in long golden sheets. 200 chairs faced a raised platform where a podium stood beside a large screen for presentations. Vanessa took the stage at 3 o'clock. She gave the Riverside Project update first. The structural solution, the cost savings, the revised timeline. She presented the numbers cleanly, without embellishment. The audience nodded. This was what they were here for: numbers, progress, returns.
Then she paused. Before we move to questions, Vanessa said, I need to address something that has come to my attention regarding the integrity of our internal systems. The room shifted. 200 people recalibrating their attention. Patricia, seated in the front row, looked up from her tablet with a frown. Marcus Webb, 3 seats over, set down his coffee. Charles, near the back, went very still. 3 weeks ago, Vanessa continued, a consulting engineer named Ryan Carter was suspended from the Riverside project based on access logs that showed he had downloaded proprietary financial documents outside the scope of his role. These logs were presented to our COO, Patricia Huang, and formed the basis for Mr. Carter's suspension. She clicked the remote. The screen behind her showed 2 documents side by side, the modified access logs and the raw server data. These logs were falsified. The silence was immediate and total. Our cybersecurity team conducted a full forensic audit of the server records. The original data shows that Mr. Carter accessed only structural engineering files within his authorized scope. Someone with administrative access overwrote the file reference names in a duplicate log to make it appear that Mr. Carter had accessed financial documents he never touched. She clicked again. The screen showed the VPN connection records, the IP trace, the link to Arden Phillips Associates. The modification was routed through an external VPN connected to a cybersecurity consulting firm called Arden Phillips Associates, a firm with a documented relationship to Harrington Capital. Every head in the room turned toward Charles Beaumont. Charles didn't move. His face was a mask of composed surprise, the expression of a man who was performing astonishment while calculating escape routes. This is absurd, he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall with practiced authority. Vanessa, you can't seriously be suggesting— I'm not suggesting anything, Charles. I'm presenting evidence. The logs were modified. The modification traces back to your network. And the timing coincides precisely with your expressed concern to Marcus Webb about Mr. Carter's presence at this company. Marcus Webb looked at Charles, then at Vanessa, then back at Charles. His expression was the particular mask of a man realizing he'd been standing next to a fire he didn't start, but was about to get burned by. Charles, Marcus said carefully, is any of this true? Of course not. This is a fabrication, a desperate attempt by Ms. Whitmore to protect a personal relationship that has compromised her professional judgment. My professional judgment, Vanessa said, saved this company $12 million on the Riverside project. That fix came from Ryan Carter, the same man you tried to frame. You hired a maintenance worker and gave him access to proprietary systems based on a personal infatuation. That's not judgment, that's recklessness. I hired an engineer who was blacklisted for exposing corruption at his previous firm. He solved a structural crisis that your own investment team failed to identify during due diligence. And when he started earning respect on his own merits, someone decided he needed to be removed. She stepped out from behind the podium and looked directly at Charles. You sent me flowers, Charles. White lilies, very elegant. You took me to restaurants where the menus don't have prices. You said you understood what it was like to lose someone and build walls. And the whole time you were building a case to destroy a man whose only crime was being better at something than you were comfortable with. Charles stood up. His composure was cracking now. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small fissures around his eyes and mouth, the way a foundation cracks when the load it's bearing exceeds what it was designed for. You have no proof that I have server logs, VPN traces, and a forensic report from a former FBI cybersecurity analyst. I also have a formal complaint filed with the State Bar Association regarding Arden Phillips's involvement in the falsification of corporate records. If you'd like to dispute any of this, I'd encourage you to do so through your attorney. The room was watching Charles the way an audience watches a building being demolished, with fascination, with horror, and with the undeniable understanding that what was falling had been hollow for a long time. Charles looked around the hall, at the investors who had respected him, at the board members who had trusted him, at Marcus Webb, who was already leaning away as if proximity might be contagious. He didn't say anything else. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, walked down the center aisle, and left the building. The doors closed behind him with a sound that was too quiet for what it represented. Vanessa stood on the stage and felt the silence settle over the room like dust after an implosion. 200 people staring at her, waiting to see what came next. I owe Ryan Carter an apology, she said. This company owes him an apology. He was punished for someone else's agenda, and that is unacceptable. In this company and in any company. She paused. I also owe my daughter an answer. A month ago, she stood on a stage not so different from this one and asked me when she was going to get a father she could love. I've spent the last 4 weeks meeting successful, accomplished, impressive men. Men with money, men with status, men who look right next to me in photographs. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly behind the podium, and she gripped the edges to keep them still. None of them asked about becoming a father. None of them knew how to talk a scared girl through the dark. None of them solved an engineering crisis with handwritten notes and then refused to take credit for it. She took a breath. I'm not going to stand up here and pretend I have this figured out. I don't. I'm a mess. I work too much. I parent too little. I've spent 6 years hiding behind buildings because I was too afraid to feel anything that might hurt. But I'm done choosing people who make sense on paper. I want the person who makes sense in my life. From the third row, a small figure stood up. Emma had come with Margaret. Vanessa hadn't known she was there. She was wearing her school uniform, her braids slightly messy from the car ride, her face carrying that expression of absolute resolve that she'd inherited from a father who had died believing that buildings were just bones, and people were what made them breathe. She walked to the front of the room, not to the stage, to the audience. She looked at the rows of wealthy, powerful, accomplished men who had come here to hear about returns and forecasts and quarterly projections. None of you talked about being a dad, she said. Her voice was thin in the high-ceilinged room, but it carried the way a child's voice always carries. Without artifice, without calculation, without anything but the plain, unbearable truth. She turned and walked through the crowd, past the investors, past the board members, past Marcus Webb and Patricia Huang, and every person in the room who measured the world in numbers and contracts and strategic advantage. She walked to the back of the hall. Ryan was standing just inside the door. Vanessa had texted him that morning. Come to Connecticut. Don't ask why yet. Just come. He'd come. He was wearing his too big button-down shirt and his polished shoes and an expression that was halfway between confusion and the terrible hope of a man who has been let down enough times to know that hope is dangerous, but can't stop feeling it anyway. Emma stopped in front of him. She reached up and took his hand. I don't need someone famous, she said. I just need someone kind. The room held its breath. Ryan looked down at Emma. Then he looked across the hall at Vanessa, who was standing on the stage with tears running down her face in a way that was ugly and public and completely uncontrolled. Nothing like the composed, polished, camera-ready woman who had stood on a different stage a month ago and pretended she had everything figured out. He didn't say anything. He just squeezed Emma's hand. Noah appeared from behind Ryan's leg. He'd come too because when you're 8 and your dad says you're going to Connecticut, you go to Connecticut. Is this the part where we all hug? Noah asked. Emma looked at him. Don't make it weird. You're the one holding my dad's hand. Because your dad is nice. I know he's nice. He's my dad. Vanessa stepped off the stage. She walked down the aisle, past 200 people who were watching her dismantle her own image in real time, past the life she was supposed to live, and the choices she was supposed to make, and the man she was supposed to choose. She reached Ryan. Hi, she said. Hi. I just destroyed a man's career in front of 200 investors. I heard. You're kind of terrifying. Is that a problem? It's my favorite thing about you. She laughed. Wet, broken, the kind of laugh that's so close to crying that the body can't tell the difference. I choose you, she said. Not because you're perfect. Not because it makes sense. Because you're the only person who's ever made me feel like I could stop running. Ryan looked at her. At Emma, still holding his hand. At Noah, who had already lost interest in the romantic moment and was examining the stone floor with professional curiosity. I can't give you what Charles could give you, he said. I live in a studio apartment. I drive a 12-year-old car. I can't take you to restaurants without prices on the menu. I don't want restaurants without prices. I want turkey sandwiches on a park bench. That can be arranged. And he kissed her. Not perfectly, not cinematically. His nose bumped hers slightly, and Emma said, "Ew," and Noah asked if they could go get pizza. And somewhere in the back of the hall, Patricia Huang was already drafting a press release, and Marcus Webb was recalculating his risk assessment, and the world kept spinning the way it always does when two imperfect people decide to stop being afraid of each other. 7 months later, they got married. Not at the Ashford estate. Not at a Manhattan hotel with crystal chandeliers and 500 guests. At a farmhouse in upstate New York that belonged to nobody important. A rental property with a crooked porch and a kitchen that smelled like old wood, and a backyard big enough for 32 people, which was the exact number who showed up. Vanessa wore a simple white dress that she'd bought off a rack, and it fit perfectly, and she didn't care. Ryan wore a suit that actually fit this time because Vanessa had taken him to a tailor in Brooklyn who specialized in men who hated shopping and had spent their entire lives wearing clothes that didn't match their bodies. Douglas Pratt came. Lisa Nguyen came. Frank DeLuca came, wearing a tie for what he claimed was the first time in 11 years. Gerald came, without his tablet, which everyone agreed was a miracle. Margaret cried during the ceremony. She pretended she wasn't crying, and everybody pretended to believe her. After the guests left, the four of them stood in the farmhouse kitchen, Vanessa and Ryan and Emma and Noah, and cooked dinner together, pasta, because it was the only thing all four of them could agree on. Vanessa burned the garlic. Ryan overcooked the noodles. Emma complained that the sauce needed more salt. Noah ate 3 breadsticks before dinner was ready, and then claimed he wasn't hungry, then ate 2 plates of pasta anyway. It was chaotic and imperfect and exactly right. Later that evening, after the kids were asleep, Emma in the upstairs bedroom and Noah on the pull-out couch because he'd insisted sleeping bags were for camping, not houses, Ryan and Vanessa sat on the crooked porch and watched the sky go dark over the hills. "I want to tell you something," Ryan said. "Okay." "I've been thinking about what happened, all of it, Mercer and Holt, the blacklisting, the maintenance job, the elevator, you." He paused, turning something over in his hands, a folded piece of paper that Vanessa recognized as one of his handwritten calculation sheets. "When I blew the whistle, I thought I was doing the right thing, and I was. But I also thought it would cost me everything, and it did, and I spent 4 years believing that the cost was the point, that doing the right thing meant suffering for it, that you couldn't have integrity and a life. And now? Now I think the cost wasn't the point. I think the point was that I needed to be in that basement, fixing that junction box on the day your elevator broke. I needed to be nobody so I could be in the right place when someone needed me." Vanessa leaned her head against his shoulder. "That's a lot of meaning to put on a broken elevator." "Engineers see structure everywhere. It's a professional hazard." She smiled into the fabric of his shirt. "I want to build something," Ryan said. "Not a building, a foundation. For workers who get blacklisted for doing the right thing, for single parents who lose everything because they won't keep quiet. I want to use what happened to me, to us, and make it mean something for people who don't have a billionaire to fight for them." Vanessa lifted her head and looked at him. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since the park. Since Noah and Emma started arguing about dinosaurs and I realized that our kids were going to grow up knowing that their parents fought for things that mattered. I want to give that to other families too." "How much do you need?" "I haven't done the numbers yet." "Ryan, you always do the numbers." He unfolded the piece of paper. It was a budget. Handwritten, precise, modest. The kind of budget a man writes when he's used to having nothing and is afraid to ask for too much. Vanessa looked at it for a long time. "Double it," she said. "Vanessa, you're always too conservative with your estimates. Double it, and we'll call it a start." He looked at her in the fading light, and his face did something she'd never seen it do before. It opened completely. No doors, no walls, no careful composure. Just a man looking at a woman who believed in him, and the raw, staggering vulnerability of being believed in when you'd stopped expecting it. "I love you," he said. It was the first time either of them had said it. They'd been circling it for months, implying it, demonstrating it, proving it through actions and choices and the simple daily accumulation of showing up. But neither of them had said the words, because words like that carry weight, and both of them had learned the hard way that weight can crush you if you're not ready to bear it. "I love you too," Vanessa said, "and I'm terrible at it. I'll work too much. I'll forget to call. I'll try to fix things with money when what you need is time. I'll probably burn the garlic every single night for the rest of our lives.
I'll overcook the pasta. Then we'll eat bad food together. Deal. From inside the house, a sound drifted through the screen door. Emma's voice, high and indignant, and Noah's voice, lower and equally stubborn, arguing about ice cream flavors even though they were supposed to be asleep. Vanilla is boring, Noah. Vanilla is classic. There's a difference. Classic is just a fancy word for boring. You're a fancy word for boring. That doesn't even make sense. Your face doesn't make sense. Vanessa and Ryan sat on the porch and listened to their children argue, and they laughed. The quiet, exhausted, grateful laughter of two people who had been alone for a very long time and suddenly, impossibly, weren't. The night settled around them. The hills went black against a sky full of stars that you could never see from Manhattan.
Somewhere in the house, the argument about ice cream evolved into a negotiation about whose turn it was to choose the morning cereal, and then into silence, and then into the deep, trusting sleep of children who knew, finally, fully, without reservation, that they were home. Vanessa thought about what Emma had said on that stage, a lifetime ago. I don't need someone famous. I just need someone kind. She thought about all the things she'd built, the towers, the company, the reputation, the walls. She thought about the Forbes covers and the board meetings and the midnight conference calls and the years she'd spent proving to the world that she didn't need anyone. She thought about a man who walked into a coffee shop for terrible empanadas and never walked out of her heart. She thought about a man who talked a scared girl through the dark and never asked for anything in return. And she understood, finally, sitting on a crooked porch in clothes that weren't designer and a house that wasn't hers, with burned garlic on her fingers, and a man beside her who smelled like overcooked pasta and cheap soap and everything she'd ever wanted. She understood that money can build empires and power can command respect, but neither of them can build a family. Only love does that, and sometimes the person who saves you is the one the world never thought was important enough to notice.